Naomi Wolf is the author of 7 books, including New York Times bestsellers The Beauty Myth, The End of America, and Give Me Liberty. Her essays and writings have appeared in the New Republic, Esquire, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and the New York Times. She lives with her family in New York City. With the publication of The Beauty Myth, she became a leading spokesperson for what was later described as the third wave of the feminist movement. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
Why is history important?
Oh, so we don't make the same mistakes over and over, especially women's history, because one way that women are kept subordinated is that their accomplishments and their insights about themselves get erased from one generation to the next.
And how does a rare book library, or any kind of library, play into the importance of history?
Well, it's critical, isn't it? I just heard that Canada is underfunding its archives, and I think that's a very political act and a dangerous one, because it means that any ideologue can create a national memory or distort national memory. The same thing is happening in the United States. Archives are being classified or concealed, or FOIA requests are not being honored. An archive or a library helps individuals become educated, obviously, but it helps with transparency. It helps a community keep its leaders accountable, and it helps people know what's possible. I mean, if we wiped out the accomplishments of the Enlightenment, it would be so much easier to bring the world back into a dark age. The archive of the Enlightenment helps us remember what are human rights, what's democracy, and so on, what's feminism.
And that's really what your book, The End of America, talked to, how governments can subvert free expression and the Constitution.
Right.
The fact that governments are cutting funding for important institutions whose role it is to present history to its citizenry, would you classify that as one of your top 10?
Oh, it's up there. I mean, if what you're saying is the underfunding of education and libraries and archives part of what I call the fascist shift, definitely. It's absolutely, and a whole book could be written just about that, but it's way up there. I would put it with the top 10 if I had room. I would say that it fits into one of the subheads, though I didn't address it in the book specifically, that has to do with calling dissent treason, because every fascist crackdown, and we're definitely, my Canadian correspondents and colleagues are detailing that this government, if you don't mind my wading right in, is really taking many cues from the Bush era in suppressing all kinds of democracy and accountability in similar ways, and militarizing Canada in similar ways that Bush did the United States and that Obama in many ways is continuing. But to have a crackdown against democracy, you really need to dumb down populations and have just a few outlets for discourse and have those be government-controlled or controlled by corporations or a mix of the two. And archives and libraries are very empowering to citizens to resist that. And they're very empowering to citizens to help citizens create their own dissent and their own dialogue, their own debate, and engage in critical thinking. They're vital. They are the oxygen of democracy.
The other thing, too, is there's a sort of an accountability and there's a proof of wrongdoing when you can trace it to source documents.
Exactly right. There's nothing more powerful. I mean, otherwise it's just hearsay. This is why my government is classifying all of its wrongdoing so that journalists and historians can't point a finger. It's part of a whole chain. I mean, the classification and underfunding of archives and libraries and public schools is part of a chain that extends to penalizing whistleblowers and to Julian Assange.
A fascinating situation, and one that talks to feminism.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
I admire your position on what's happening with him. It seems that it's his word against the women's word.
That's very tricky. I want to be very clear. I defend Assange's free speech rights. I am a champion of Assange's right to publish. I have no idea what happened between these people.
And nor does anyone else, other than those
right.
players
and
involved.
Ideally justice will be done.
And you can't prove one way or the other way. It's his word against their
word.
Well,
I don't want to go that far because I think that it's very, very, very complicated, but what is clear is that justice needs to be done in a way that doesn't involve the United States government putting pressure on Sweden to use these charges as an excuse to send him to Guantanamo. Yeah. That's as far as I will go with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Getting back to then history and its co-opting of history. This is another thing that the Canadian government seems to have been doing. While it cuts back libraries and archives on one hand, it takes money that could have gone to that arm's length institution to fund celebrations of the War of 1812, for example.
Interesting.
Which glorifies the history of war.
Right.
And thus that's the table for the funding of fighter jets.
And this is all about money. You've got some of the very same forces at work in Canada that I detailed in America, at the end of America. These are global corporations. Boeing is global. Halliburton is global. And the players in Canada who want to take over the natural resources, exploit the oil, and engage Canada's treasury in endless war overseas because of the munitions that can be built and the funding that can be diverted to the war industry, it is in their vested interest to create a militarized ideology, like glorifying, the War of 1812.
For World War I, the celebrations for that will be coming up.
I mean, any war you've got, there's a vested interest in marketing that. And again, there's nothing wrong with celebrating your national history, but if it goes along with wiping clean funding for, schools, libraries, archives, independent journalism, then you've got a situation in which it's easier for the younger generation to not really know what Canada stands for as a peaceful defender of freedoms around the world.
It's also about accessibility to the information, too.
Yeah, definitely. And, the Internet is the greatest threat to fascists, and that's why there's efforts to crack down on the Internet here as well as in England and in the United States by these same interests. They would like us to be stupid and ill-informed, and that's why we have to stand up for our libraries and our archives.
And this is something that really has driven you from day one as it pertains to the history of women and their plight for equality.
Yes, you mean learning from history has driven me?
Well, I suppose just an independent, if there is such a thing, an independent, objective, realistic view of what happened and why it happened and how it's subjugating various groups, including women.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a cultural historian or a cultural critic, and what that means is I'm very, very interested in looking back at history to see how things that we're told are natural or inevitable about how we think about men and women or sexuality or politics actually are quote-unquote socially constructed. They're kind of invented. And if you look back at any ideology, you can see from history that it changes over time. In the 19th century, women were told they couldn't get a higher education because their uteruses didn't allow them to think clearly. That was a socially constructed idea to keep women down. It's useful to know these things.
But it's funny, in your latest book, Vagina, you do talk about that direct connection between the vagina and the brain, and it clearly does affect the way you think.
Yes, so to transition to that, but the connection doesn't demean women. It actually helps us understand why we should respect women.
And it empowers women.
And it empowers women. And so let me back up for readers who are hearing this for the first time. It is a rather startling sentence unless you have some context around it, which I offer people in my new book, Vagina, a New Biography. So there is a great deal of neuroscience in the last 15 or 20 years, which has not been widely reported, that elucidates a brain-vagina connection. There are some headlines and takeaways, and there's also amazing new science that explains more about female arousal and desire that should help us understand female sexuality better. And again, it's not widely reported. So, for instance, when a woman is empowered by her culture to think positively about sex and about her own sexual response, and then to have an orgasm and a rewarding sexual experience, whether she's alone or in a relationship, it boosts dopamine in her brain, which is about focus, motivation, drive, assertiveness, sociability.
Self-esteem, too.
Self-esteem. It also boosts opioids, which are about bliss, ecstasy, and it boosts oxytocin, which is about connection and closeness and intimacy. So these are powerful neurotransmitters and hormones. They're powerfully positive. They're great mind states. I'm not saying...
They would sort of allow you as a woman to be the best you can be.
I don't want to make it reductive. You can get dopamine from many activities. But I am saying that if you understand the positive mind states that these, neurotransmitters and hormones create in women's minds, it explains why, for 5,000 years, female sexuality has been targeted, derided, why women are encouraged not to know about their sexuality.
Because it
empowers women. I think it's a threat.
Power.
I think, I've said, female pleasure makes women unruly and harder to control. And I stand by that. I think pleasure makes men.
It's what drives all of us.
It drives all of us.
Freud.
It's part of our drive. And not just Freud. Neuroscience is finding that the sexual drive is part of the reward system. This is not surprising. It's not new news. No. It may be shocking to people because I'm saying this is true for women as well, and it's true in unique ways. And let's look at the political consequences. This explains, what else explains why for 5,000 years there's been female genital mutilation, shaming, suppression, ignorance.
And you're also using the word vagina, which is,
It's a very taboo word.
I suppose that's part of what you're trying to do, is to bring it out into the open.
I mean, we have to discuss these things apart from everything else. And by the way, my model is very much the gay and lesbian movement, who similarly had their sexuality demeaned, mocked, derided, and finally they stopped running away and they said, look, we're queer, we're proud of it, we're dykes, we're proud of it, and we're going to reclaim what this means. Yeah. That's my intention, certainly. So 30% of women in this hypersexualized culture lack desire for sex because it's not rewarding to them. And another 30%, some of the same women, some different women, say that they do not reach orgasm when they want to. And that's the same, that those numbers haven't budged since the Height Report 40 years ago. So this sexual revolution, sex is everywhere, porn is everywhere. It's not working for women, for enough women, well enough. And the neuroscience that explains new findings about, female arousal, for instance, that women's arousal patterns are very different from men's, and even their pelvic innervation, the nerves in their reproductive systems and their genitals are very different in how they work from men's. That, to me, is very valuable information, and it helps explain how we can make women happier, more of the time, which to me seems like a very feminist message. I can't imagine how anyone would have a problem with it.
Just finally then, if we can tie that back into history.
Yes.
It seems to me then that if you're able to access source documents and important historical materials that show how women have been subjugated, so that we can understand it, but also possibly even laugh at it or
that's good.
Demean it.
Yes, that's good.
It seems to me that might help your cause.
Oh, always. I mean, if you look at the back notes of any of my books, they're heavily, heavily researched, and I use libraries. And I use public libraries, I use university libraries, I use archives online that are publicly funded. These are invaluable resources, and they're part of why my books are taken seriously, because there's all this documentation. It's absolutely critical. If we don't have the documentation, it's just opinion, it's just hearsay. It's 1 inch, it's weightless, it's valueless if it doesn't have the documentation. And absolutely, in the case of Vagina, a new biography, it's scientific documentation. But again, those archives like PubMed, they have to be readily available to people. It's so empowering for anyone to be able to research medical archives, scientific archives. If those didn't exist, we wouldn't even be able to talk about these basic elements of how our bodies work, or bring this amazing new neuroscience about sexual response to so many women and men who are benefiting from it. I cannot thank librarians and libraries and archives enough.
Well, thanks for doing the work that you're doing, and best of luck with Vagina and wherever else you might be going. Which is where?
Well, home tomorrow for a little rest and then back out on the road.
Yeah, we're at the Kingston Writers Festival here in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much.